Hello and welcome to Changing World. My name is Anthony Smith, and today I'm very pleased to have a new guest with me by the name of Marilynn Hughes. Now, Marilynn Hughes founded the Out of Body Travel Foundation in 2003 with a mission to reduce spiritual and physical hunger worldwide. When she was 22 years old, she had her first out-of-body experience, which happened to her completely unexpectedly. This started a journey of thousands of out-of-body travel and mystical experiences. During her life, she has written around 100 books and produced 18 CDs on the subject of out-of-body travel. Marilynn was featured in a documentary film with the title The Road to Armageddon and has spoken at many conferences around the world. She has been a devout Catholic for many years and in addition was ordained as a Christian minister. Marilynn also holds an honorary doctorate in divinity and metaphysics. So welcome, Marilynn. Thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. It's good to hear from you. So
You as well.
thank you. Well, I'd like to just ask you as a starting question for the benefit of everyone listening. Could you give us a detailed account of what you experienced at the age of 22, and how that experience has completely transformed your life?
Well, it started pretty simply, actually, with a single out-of-body experience. I was in that twilight period between sleep and awake, and all of a sudden I tried to roll over and get out of bed, and I sure did. I rolled out, and I was moving my arms, and what I realized was my arm wasn't moving. It wasn't my body that was moving as I was rolling. It was this light body. So when I moved my arms, I would see a light arm come up rather than my physical arm. And so then when I rolled over, my light body came out of the physical body, and it that's when I had my first out-of-body experience in my adult life. And so I was, I remember floating up to the ceiling and seeing my body down below as kind of a gray lump of something, flesh or whatever. And actually, the first time I was pretty fearful. I was pretty afraid of what was going on, because when that happens, you automatically wonder, am I dying or what's going on here, And so I had that experience. It was very short, but then, I started having them, every few weeks or so I would have something along those lines, and I started journaling about them. And with each out-of-body experience, I would be taken to another level. So with each experience, I would be taught something else. So, the next few experiences, I would be learning about moving around in a spiritual body versus a physical body. I would learn about how to see and hear from, because all of this is different. It's from your consciousness rather than from, physical movement. And so, and then also learning how to permeate substances, like how to move through a window or a wall to eventually move to traveling the overlapping astral realm outside. And that was just the beginning, literally just the beginning, because, now 32 years later, I've traveled an infinite number of realms, and there's so many places to discover in the out-of-body experiences that can be had. But for that period of time when I was 22, it was kind of like an awakening period. And so what it did and how it changed my life forever was it made me very conscious of my calling in life, my mission, my vocation, and from the very beginning, I was being instructed very specifically as to how to proceed forward and to move to the next phase of the out-of-body experience with each encounter. And it's been that way ever since, and it accelerates even more after a few years. You have them more frequently, and then it accelerates again, and so then you start having them as a matter of due course, almost like a regular part of your day. Almost every day you might have them at that point, which I do now, and they become a huge, they become a huge part of helping a person and a soul to discern what is best for them, or how to view things, or how to see things through the eyes of God versus just our own limited eyes. We also, one of the big reasons that this becomes, life-changing forever kind of thing when it starts up, when you have the out-of-body experiences, you enter into what, I call the God mind, and you experience things that you could not understand or experience without it. So, for instance, you experience the love of God, which is so profound and so beyond the scope of human understanding that it's something that you are transformed by. But you are also, when you're entering into the God mind, you are also experiencing this status while you're within it, where you have this temporary understanding of a lot of mysteries. So it's like all things that didn't make sense to you before, it just makes sense to you now. It's like you're experiencing the mystery behind some of the things that maybe were a little bit harder to understand in terms of existence. So there's so when you're that, in terms of the age of 22, that has a lot to do with why it became so totally life-changing, because when you're talking about out-of-body experiences, you're really looking at entering into the love and the knowledge of God, and that changes us because it's so far beyond anything that we can think or feel or even emote, because we definitely do learn from these experiences how God loves, which is so much different than we do. And we also learn these intricate machinations of the universe that, priorly didn't make sense to us. And all of a sudden we're being drawn into the mystery of that, so to speak.
Right. Well, that's quite fascinating, because obviously these things, to most people, they've never experienced it, so it's hard for them to sometimes relate to these experiences. So, I mean, considering a lot of people listening may not have come across this phenomena, which you've experienced yourself and written about, do you think you could try and explain some of these concepts for people who may really know almost nothing about it, but who are maybe open to the possibility of it?
Well, sure. The experiences when they happen start usually pretty similarly, and so a person will begin to feel what's called the vibrational state. And the vibrational state is when all of a sudden you feel like this internal vibration that's just so high frequency, beyond anything you could imagine. Physically, it doesn't make sense unless you understand it from this perspective. But sometimes people end up in these experiences spontaneously, and they don't really know what's going on if they have never studied this. But it's a common thing that people report, the vibrational state. And the reason you feel that vibration is because what's happening is you are detaching from your physical body to your spiritual body, and your spiritual body has an infinitely higher vibration with partically than your physical body does. And so you're literally like feeling the vibrations of your soul. A lot of times too, people will experience jet engine noises or just really loud noises around them. Again, this relates back to the fact that you are now touching into the astral plane, and it's a different vibrational sphere, so it sounds different. You'll also often hear just random voices in the ether, and those voices are the thoughts of humankind. And so you'll hear all these things because, again, it's the astral realm, and this is where a lot of the thoughts of humankind will kind of just linger. So you're going to be hearing that too. And then what happens often is someone either tries to roll over, or if they're aware of what's going on, they might try to will themselves out. Someone might try to step out. Some people will, actually be taken out of their body by either seen or unseen forces, in terms of angelic assistance. And then they will be taken out of their body. So that's your basic out-of-body experience. And that's where it would begin, but certainly not where it would end.
Right. Okay. Well, I hope that's sort of helped to explain for people who, obviously are not familiar with this particular subject. And then I thought what might be a good topic for you to speak a bit about is the subject of remote viewing. And clairvoyance, and those two are sort of kind of connected, obviously. Could you share with us a little bit about those two topics?
Well, sure. I was trained in remote viewing and have also done a lot of research on remote viewing. Clairvoyance and remote viewing are more similar to one another than they are to out-of-body travel. But what's interesting about remote viewing, and we can lead back into this with out-of-body travel in just a bit here, is that, in the mid to late 1950s, Russell Targ was given the directive to work on this new process, which eventually came to be called remote viewing, within the United States government. And from what I understand, I know other governments are utilizing these techniques as well. Currently, I'm not sure, if they started at the same time. I know Russell Targ is him and Pat Price and Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle. These are the ones who really built the program and started it out here in the U.S. And I'm pretty sure they're considered the father of remote viewing, the fathers, and that the practice may have spread to other countries because of the works that they did, but I am not sure of that. There may have been programs in the other countries that I'm unaware of. But so they started out, and they actually had a chamber that they used in the 50s that they made the walls so thick with some kind of it was like an electronically protected room so that nothing could penetrate it from the outside world. And they would put some of their viewers inside that box and then give them targets from the outside. The way that a target would be given is, back at that time, I'm not sure how they did it, but now they do it where you will receive a series of numbers which represents the target. You're not given any information about that target. And then the remote viewer would go through this process, and this process involves several phases of drawings, impressions, writing down details, general sketches, something called the matrix, which is another way to further codify and detail what they're seeing, and some other parts of it, which we don't need to belabor, but there's several parts. It's a very detailed process, actually. I think people would be surprised at the actual protocol. But what they found was that the governments were finding that these experiments into clairvoyance were providing excellent intelligence. There's some really, really fascinating stories that were really bullseye on in terms of some of the remote viewers. There were several remote viewers throughout the last 50 or so years, 70 or so years, who were considered, the best among the best. Joe McMoneagle was one of them. Pat Price was one of them. Ingo Swann. And there were some women, too, who became really, really excellent remote viewers, and literally some of the time they were able to, without any knowledge whatsoever, find a downed airplane anywhere in the world and literally find the coordinates and be able to send out a search party and find them exactly where they found them. Things like this, and figuring out where people were being held. There's other ways to find intelligence as well. We had a very unique remote viewer who, by the name of Pat Price, he was in fact the first one, who was so skilled and gifted at this that he could literally break through the barrier psychically of any place, any facility, no matter how top secret, and literally from any room in the world. And he could read the names off the files and tell you what was written on the desk, inside the building. He was so accurate that he was accurate literally to that kind of detail. Unfortunately, he passed away fairly early on. There's some speculation that he was taken out by the KGB because he was such a threat because of his gift being so great. But I guess we'll never know. But yes, the remote viewing program was discontinued in the United States at some point in the late 90s or so. But many of the government remote viewers have gone out and they founded their own companies, and they do this as private consulting, and they do it for companies and for other types of things, but they also do government contracts as well. So remote viewing is actively pursued. We know it's done to a very high level in China, to a very high level in Russia. It's utilized in world governments around the world, and it's considered to often be more reliable than certain types of intelligence. One of the things they do like to do, however, is to have 2 or 3 different intelligence sources backing up a claim, if at all possible, just for, that's the way they try to validate a potential target before they go after it, in terms of, sometimes, a lot of times with remote viewers, it's finding downed airplanes, downed choppers, or where are our men, and so they'll try to do that. But I know that there have been instances where they have gone literally on the advice of one single remote viewer who pinpointed on a globe of the world exactly where this plane went down, and they were absolutely right on. And so it's been verified by, not just the U.S. government, but world governments. I'm sure there's some use of it as well in the U.K. Would you know about that, Anthony?
Well, to be honest with you, I think they keep it under wraps, and
Okay.
I wouldn't know myself, no, unfortunately.
Okay.
But it's true what you said. I can imagine a lot of governments around the world, do investigate these things, of course.
Right, and the one thing, clairvoyance and remote viewing, they're very similar. It's just that remote viewing is an actual protocol which utilizes psychic gifts, clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is something that people can have, spontaneously. It doesn't necessarily have to be within that protocol. So just so people understand that, it's a very similar thing. Another thing that the experiments of Russell Targ and crew, him and Hal Puthoff, and there were a lot of people involved in these things, but they found that by utilizing their protocol, that there is basically an underlying current of intuitive ability, which, intuitive / psychic ability that most people can touch into to some degree. We know that there are some people who are just more gifted in that way by nature, but they have found, and this is one of the interesting things that they have brought out, is that it is an inherent human ability to be able to touch into what would have in the past would have been considered psychic. And one of the things they wrote about this and have talked about regarding this is that that what this indicates is that there is this vast unconscious reservoir of knowledge that we all share in, because what they would see with, someone being able to pinpoint, and not only just one person, but many people at the same time. And they've also done the experiments of teaching non-military users and they tried training those who have known psychic gifts versus those who have no known psychic gifts, and they find that they can train both. And the difference in the outcome is not usually that large, with the exception, of the presence of a Pat Price or an Ingo Swann, Joe McMonigal, or I just don't unfortunately remember the names of these women that were involved in the program, but they had a couple of women who were really, really accurate. So with the exception of the people who are just unusually gifted, there can be a similar result in terms of accuracy through using the remote viewing protocol, that you can actually bring out this intuitive latency, so to speak, within almost anyone. And that's why in the United States, it's now pretty common. People, if they want to, can go take classes and learn how to do remote viewing, because it has a lot of applications, not just military. People are using it for their own private lives, and of course in criminal investigations it can be used for a lot of different reasons.
Exactly. Well, you've certainly given a very thorough account of that. I really think it's interesting that what some people might just say is just mumbo jumbo, has actually been used by government agencies around the world. So it's not as though we're talking about something which is, just considered to be not worth dealing with. It's a real phenomenon that has been proven to get results, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. And, even one of our Apollo astronauts who recently passed a few years ago, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, was very much involved in the remote viewing phenomenon, and very much involved, ironically, in the psychic research that was going on in the late 60s and early 70s in both the United States and Russia at that time, where at that time there was some they were working together, and we were sending some people over there, they were sending some people back, and we would do a lot of different experiments on the concept of psychic gifts. That was a big time in these types of things. And so yes, one of our astronauts wrote a bunch of books about these subjects as well, because he was not only involved in those things when he returned from space, but what made him more interested in it was the experiences he had while he was in space. And those experiences included where he fell into, and he said that the other astronauts kind of experienced this too, and different astronauts speak about what they feel comfortable with. But Dr. Edgar Mitchell wrote about this in detail, how he fell into this state, which he later understood to be the samadhi or the nirvana of the Hindus and the Buddhists, and the ecstasy of the Christians, which really confounded him, because somehow when he was out in space, there was something different molecularly that brought the astronauts into this like cosmic consciousness state. They all felt it was different, and that's what drew him into that interest when he returned from space.
Right, that's another fascinating subject. And, I've always felt that the astronauts knew a lot more than what they let onto the public, especially Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And in fact, Buzz Aldrin has done many interviews where he's kind of, shown that there is more to things than what we're aware and what we're told generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do imagine that that's the case, and I know that there are a lot of theories about that, and we could go in that direction, but probably. But there were a lot of things that they experienced that they had to keep private to themselves. There were a lot of pictures of the moon that had to be kept as classified with NASA.
Right. Yeah.
And so they had certain restrictions on what they were allowed to talk about and what they weren't allowed to talk about, and that's true. Yeah,
I certainly believe that's true. It's such a big subject. I mean, that's a whole nother subject in itself, that one.
Yeah.
About what's going on out there, we can only speculate, can't we? We don't know all that's going on out there.
Well, we can maybe you and I can only speculate, but we do have people who can do more than speculate because they have more information, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, as I say, that's another subject in itself, all of that. And
yes.
There's so much on the internet, on YouTube. People have done interviews, haven't they? And talked about stuff that is just mind-blowing, really.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
But Dr. Edgar Mitchell was also very involved with the remote viewing programs, and along with those other psychic programs. And he was also very interested in what's called quantum hologram theory, which was also related to the experiences he had in space. But anybody can look this up if they're interested. But there was a shift about 10, 20 years ago in, astrophysics, where they're moving towards what's called a quantum hologram theory. Dr. Edgar Mitchell actually has some videos where he's explaining what that is. You can look those up on YouTube or I think there might even be one on Amazon Prime, but you can check out what he was saying about it, before he died, which is very, very interesting because of the fact that he had been out to space, and then he was also contributing and participating in a lot of the science that was moving forward for the rest of his life.
Right. Well, that's another thing that people might want to check into. What we'll do is we'll put a few links down below the video, and then people can click on those and have a look at some other material if they want to follow up. Now, I was going to ask you a few things. You say that you've been shown a series of potential outcomes for our world. Would you like to just go into a bit of detail about that?
Well, it's interesting because in the early 90s I started having what would be kind of prophetic type experiences about a time frame that we are entering upon right now. And many of these experiences showed me like this line of demarcation between, what we know as civilization today and some great change that was going to take place. I was shown that there were several possible ways that these things could go down. Obviously, the first one would be that everything would stay the same, but I was shown as well the aftermath of a huge nuclear war. I was then also shown the aftermath of a huge asteroid strike, and I was also shown the aftermath of a series of natural disasters that possibly could be related to some shifting in the earth, whether it's earthquakes, volcanoes, and things like that. Go ahead.
That's right. Now, one of my previous guests, by the name of Terry Moore, he's done a lot of research into this pole shift idea.
Yes.
Of course, you know about. And he's saying that it won't just flip in a few seconds or a few days. It will take quite a while, and it's the magnetic pole is already moving. It's being tracked. It is moving. But the question is how far it's going to move, and what the consequences are. But he's saying a lot of the problems with the weather, which I know over in America you've had things like hurricanes, of course, but you've also had a lot of snow in places in America, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he's saying that some of these weather events could be connected with the movement of the pole. And of course that's the environmental issues as well, the fact that a lot of the ice caps are melting, a lot of the ice is melting there as the poles are moving. Obviously, if the pole is moving, then if the area that was the part of the pole, if it's no longer part of the pole, then that area is going to melt. That part of the Arctic or the Antarctic could melt. So his theory is that there's a lot of people going around saying that man is the cause of all of these things, but what he's saying is that there's also the actual things beyond our control. That some of these things are in fact beyond our control. So I don't know what would your view be on that.
Well, that's very interesting what he's saying, and it's been discovered below Antarctica that there was some type of civilization in the northern parts of it that may have been a tropical climate at some time. So what does that tell us? It tells us that these kinds of things may have occurred before, and that it may be part of the way that the Earth renews itself. And we also know we've seen different types of maps and where the land masses end and where they are now. And so it is always possible that the pole shift could create some redistribution of the land masses, and that some places that were hot could be cold, and vice versa, and in between. And I think that that very well could be a part of the natural, the natural process of planets in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these things are happening on a gigantic scale out in the universe, aren't they? And
Yes.
we're so fortunate on this planet to have everything in equilibrium, the right temperature, enough water, and enough sunlight to sustain life. This is the thing, and I mean, when you think how huge, how vast the universe is, it's there must be so many planets out there which are capable of supporting life, mustn't there?
Well, I think that that's kind of the argument for it, for sure, and I definitely agree that there probably are life containing planets out there. But we also have the question, which is something that was posed to me through my out-of-body experiences, that there could be other kinds of life that would require different elements than we might to stay alive. And we have to keep that in mind as well, so that we can have different kinds of living planets. Yeah. But another thing that we often forget when we're talking about like what's happening to the Earth right now is things like I was on another show talking with Marshall Masters, and he's a scientist who talks about the 36,000 year incoming of this planet X, which is it's a planet in our solar system that goes pretty far out, and it has an elliptical rotation around the sun, but its orbit is so long that it takes 36,000 years to make it all the way around. So it's coming around for its elliptical rotation, according to Masters, and there is a pull from that planet. And so, ironically, he's saying that the pole shift is being caused a great deal by the pull of Planet X as it's moving by our planet.
Yeah, I have come across this type of theory, and there was an author who actually did a lot of research into this, and his name is Zecharia Sitchin.
Yes.
You know that one. Yes. And he wrote a series of books, actually, and one of the books which I have, it talks about Planet X, and it also talks about the fact that there were other civilizations on other planets in the solar system, including Mars.
Right.
And that if this planet does, it, like you say, if it's on a really far out orbit and it just comes in once every 36,000 years, you said, that they could be, the theory is that there was a civilization actually on that planet.
Right.
Have you heard this?
Yes, because I read the entire series by Zecharia Sitchin. Very big fan of Mr. Sitchin. Yeah.
I mean, he's done such a lot of research. I know he actually researched the Sumerian culture, didn't he?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he found all sorts of unusual artifacts from the Sumerians, and some of them were symbols, which he said there were cylinder seals, which were the kind of the artwork on a cylinder which would contain either certain manuscripts or certain treasures inside the cylinder. And a few of the things showed apparently these spaceships or something. It only looked like a spaceship, and yet this was some kind of artwork which was drawn by the Sumerians many thousands of years BC.
Right. Yes.
So it's just amazing that these things can happen. And then, of course, you have the Nazca lines in Peru, which the Nazca lines are interesting because you can only really make out what they are when you go up high in space. I mean, high in the sky.
Right.
So it's almost to suggest that whoever created those Nazca lines, did it for the benefit of someone who was high up there, flying right high up in the sky.
Yeah, almost like landmarks for people flying to know where they were.
Yeah,
Or,
Because why else would they create them? I mean, the only way you can see those, make out what they really are, is by going really high up in a plane. And
right.
That's the only way you can know what they are. From the ground, it just looks like lines going off into the distance. So it does make you wonder, what has taken place on Earth, and they're constantly finding new artifacts which suggest that some of these civilizations were far more advanced than we actually realized.
Right. Yes. And even in I believe it was Eric von Daniken, maybe, who wrote Chariots of the Gods.
Yeah.
I believe in some of his books he spoke about there are certain places in India where they've found ancient cities that are 60 to 80 feet below ground.
Right.
And those places are actually radioactive, indicating the possibility that there have been previous nuclear wars. And that happened before, and then we end up kind of having to start all over again,
Yeah.
as a species. And it does seem, even in my out-of-body experiences, it does that is a running theme, that this time that we're in is a time where we will determine, if we are going to move forward or turn back again. And turning back again would mean, some of the things that people predict a lot about with the destruction or, nuclear war, or if the earth changes, cause, a cleansing of the earth and we kind of have to rebuild, things like that. And so it seems this is a natural cycle of the earth that we've seen before.
Well, I think that's very true. I mean, there is a saying, history repeats itself, and we can only speculate about what has gone on in the earth, on the earth. Who knows, for many hundreds of thousands of years, and obviously a lot of that history has been lost.
Right.
So I think history goes back as far as some of these ancient cultures. Obviously, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, those sorts of people. The speculation is that before the Egyptians, we had the Atlantis.
Oh, yes. And the Lemurians.
Yeah, and that's, this is obviously, it's so difficult to prove any of this. All that people can do is try and give a bit of evidence for these civilizations, but there is certainly some evidence of it. And obviously people are still searching for the remnants of these civilizations, where exactly was Atlantis. There's many theories on that, isn't there?
Yeah, there are a lot of theories. One thing that I find interesting about that, though, was that Edgar Cayce had claimed that humanity would find Atlantis in 1968. And in 1968, the buried city on ancient Minoa was found, which is off the island of Greece.
All right.
And so I believe that's a very high possibility that that particular island could have been. There's a lot of other reasons to support that. Excuse me. But there are also a lot of other locations that people have found, which ironically, goes to support this whole idea. People have found so many underwater cities that it goes to support the idea that land masses have moved throughout the world's history, because we have so many of them on the ocean floor.
Yeah. I mean, there's still so much waiting there to be discovered, which is, it could be buried hundreds of feet below the surface, and so eventually these things, there will be many more discoveries. There are discoveries happening all the time, aren't there?
Oh, yeah. And in archaeology, one of the things in archaeology that's fascinating is sometimes people question, well, did this or that really happen? Did that or this really ever happen? And then inevitably they often find the actual place it did occur, whether it was Sodom and Gomorrah or the original Mount Sinai, and then there's also these different underground locations, all these different pyramidal cities that are around the world.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. On that point, there's recently there's the Bosnian pyramid.
Oh, I was thinking of that too, because I am so fascinated by the Bosnian pyramid.
Right, which is pretty huge, isn't it? Apparently.
Apparently, I think it was bigger than the Great Pyramid in Giza.
Right. And they're still excavating that. Obviously they have found quite a few artifacts, but it's still ongoing, I think, that one.
Yeah, that one could take hundreds of years, I think, to totally excavate carefully. Yeah.
I can believe that, yeah. And then, of course, there's a few things out in Turkey. There's Göbekli Tepe, which is, again, is something which was buried. It was found buried, and they're gradually excavating that away because it was buried quite deeply, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, it's a lot of these things have just been lost. And then, of course, there's quite a few that have been found in South America, in the jungle, because everything was so overgrown. Obviously, the way that the jungles grow is that they'll just, completely cover everything with trees and with shrubs and grass, and it makes it very difficult for things to be discovered. But they have found that there's quite a few ancient cities which they've discovered recently have actually been covered in all this trees and shrubs and everything, and they've had to dig it all out and excavate it, and found there was actually a city underneath it.
Yes, and I believe I've recently read too that they feel that they'll find many more as they're able to move through that entire jungle, because a lot of that stuff you can't even see it from above as long as it's covered in the jungle brush.
That's right. I mean, I think they have to use certain specialist equipment in order to locate it. Equipment which can either penetrate through all those the jungle down to the ground, and actually, I don't know if it's sonar or some kind of microwaves or something that they can actually beam at the ground and check if there's anything anomalous actually inside under the ground, like something man-made actually beneath the surface.
Right.
So there are ways that they can discover these things. But yeah, it's another fascinating subject, isn't it? The fact that we're slowly finding out more about the civilizations which have been before us on the
Right.
Earth.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So I think were we going to talk about your latest book, which is let me see, it's Destiny and Prophecy. Is that your latest one?
It's not the latest one, but it's definitely much more related to what we're talking about today.
Okay.
That's a book in the Mystic Knowledge series.
All right. And would you like to say something about that one?
Sure. Destiny and Prophecy contains most of the prophetic experiences that I've had literally over the last 30-some years, but it also explains a lot about how destiny works in our individual lives. And it's a part of the Mystic Knowledge series, which is a series of 14 books, and each of them utilizes my out-of-body experiences on a particular subject. So, you know, there's a volume on reincarnation, karma. There's one on spiritual warfare, angels and demons. And this one is particularly on destiny and prophecy. And it talks a lot about all the things that I did see in relation to the times that we are coming up to, including, you know, that I was shown in the early 90s that the time that would be crucial for what we're going to see with our world will be 2026 to 2030. Okay. And that those years would determine whatever's going to happen, but it will happen after that. And so what that means is, are we as a species going to move spiritually forward into a more unitive type of peaceful environment? Or is it going to go backwards? If it's going to go backwards, we could be looking at more wars. We could be looking at more natural disasters. We could be looking at something cataclysmic happening naturally that would change things like earth changes or asteroid, you know, something like that. But what I was shown was that things changed. They had the potential to change dramatically. One thing I'd like to say about that, though, is to remind people that this message was given to me as this time will determine how it goes, 2026 to 2030. And what does that mean to your average listener? It's that it's not set in stone. You know, and in 1917, Our Lady of Fatima said that we needed to pray to avert some of these wars that were coming and some of these chastisements. And so she told everyone to pray the rosary to pray for world peace. And what I would suggest is that we can all, in our own individual lives, be praying for a peaceful, unitive outcome where we actually take the earth over this period of time into a higher construct, a higher shift, where we would actually be moving into a higher level of the Homo sapien, you know, rather than moving ourselves back into this perpetual karmic flow that we have held for thousands of years. And, you know, every certain amount of, you know, millennia, there is an opportunity for humanity to rise, you know, for enlightenment of some level to occur, and then humanity as a whole can rise together. If it's not met, then a lot of times there's something very dramatic that occurs that kind of shifts it back down, shifts it backwards, and we stay within this, you know, this constant division and warring and violence. And we need to be looking more towards creating a vision of peace within ourselves so we may create a vision of peace within our world. And, you know, one of the ways you can do that is learning about out-of-body travel, because that begins the individual path of purification, which will literally launch that process within you individually. So the more people who are open to, you know, opening those spiritual passages within themselves, the less likely we are going to see really catastrophic changes. It's possible we could pray our way past this, or that people could behave their way past this by actually seeking interior evolution. And you can go to my website at outofbodytravel.org, and all of our books are downloadable for free. If you're starting out, I always recommend Come to Wisdom's Door and The Mysteries of the Redemption to get you started.
Well, that's great. I mean, I must say, I think that's a very generous gesture to just make everything available for free. And
Thank you.
we'll actually put a link down below this video so that anybody can just click on that and go through to your website.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. So, what would you like to talk about then, Marilynn? Where does it go from here?
Well, I think where it goes from here is that we individually and as humanity need to become awake. And what we do to become awake, it's not being awake in the sense that you hear people talking politically, because it's not a political thing at all. It has nothing to do with that. And I don't know if they say that in the UK. In the United States, there's a thing about being woke, and it has to do with politics. It's not that.
No, we don't have that saying here.
That's it. It's it's literally becoming awakened to the spiritual journey that our soul is taking while encased in this human flesh, because that is the case. We are mortal beings. We incarnate into these bodies for an impermanent amount of time. Most of us as humans will live our lives almost in denial of the state of death. We know that nobody gets out of here alive, but we forget that the very fact that we're created that way here indicates that this is one schoolroom, one class, so to speak, and we don't want to waste our time here because we don't have a lot of it. We want to get engaged in the spiritual work that stands before us. And the spiritual work involves the purification of the soul. And it's detailed in my books in a great deal. But we have to look at the good and evil within ourselves. We have to look at the good and evil within our world. And we learn through out-of-body travel to transform energetically aspects of ourselves to bring our vibration to higher and higher levels, the vibration we talked about in the beginning, because the higher that vibration goes, the higher we can go in our vibration, the higher knowledge that we are reaching, because in the mystical realms, knowledge is all about vibration. And so we want to increase our vibration, and we do that through purification. So it's an intrinsic self-examination, but it's also an intrinsic examination of all of your own beliefs, the beliefs that the world has, that you have accepted and that you see around you, and it forces you to enter into this deep spiritual contemplation, which literally thrusts you forward. And the more of us that do the process and do the work, the better for the whole planet. Because that is the actual function of this, our mortal world. Ironically, we call third and fourth dimensional worlds mortal worlds because they are the worlds where the battles between good and evil rage. They rage in the world and they rage within ourselves. So the battles between good and evil happening on mass levels, but all the way down to the personal level. And so that's why we're here. So the very nature and the very fact that you're incarnate in this realm tells you that that's what you need to accomplish in the short time that we are allotted while we are here in this realm. And people forget to look at the fact that this life, we should not be preparing to be here permanently. We should be utilizing the gifts of this realm for the purification of our understanding, of our vision, of our ability, and of our spirit. Because the only way that we can rise to a higher sphere and a higher space of knowledge, wisdom, and presence is through raising our vibrations. And the only way we can even begin to raise those vibrations is through deep prayer, meditation, and this intrinsic self-scrutiny that we must go through to start overcoming the things for which we return here again and again.
Right. Well, that was very well said. And I think that's obviously great advice for people to attempt to follow. And obviously, it's not easy. We're only human,
Right.
and yes, we make mistakes, and hopefully, we learn from our mistakes, of course. Yeah, well, it's a fantastic journey that you've obviously been on, and
Thank you.
I think it's great that you've made all this material available, because there's something like 100 books there, isn't there, that people can look at, and that's all on the website, isn't it?
Yes, there's 100 books, and there's several different series. There's 9 books in the how-to series, and each one takes you intricately higher with each book. And the experience books, you'll start with the Mysteries of the Redemption, and they continue to expand through the Mystical Captive series, the Solitary series, and others. And you're just going to find yourself realizing how deep this journey can go. And in reaction to your comment about how tough it is, the one thing I would love to share, something that Mother Angelica used to say a lot. Mother Angelica was a Catholic nun who founded the Eternal Word television network. She would talk about how the only difference between us and the saints is that when they fell down, they just got back up. And, and so sometimes we have a tendency to think that we can't do it because something we did was just too bad or too far. It's just not true. We have to remind ourselves that, yes, we are only human. Secondly, God created us that way, and that means God ordained that we would be imperfect beings. And therefore, when we fall, we take whatever time it takes to get up, but our goal is to always get up, because when you don't have to stay on the ground in your defeat or in your failure or your mistake. You get up again. You just get back up. And that's so important, because that's part of the spiritual discipline, part of the purification process, is that we do come face to face with things about ourselves that are not pleasant to deal with, look at, see, be aware of. But it's by being willing to acknowledge them that we become capable of altering them. Ironically, that's a little twist on what Dr. Phil says sometimes. You can't acknowledge what you don't change, but it does apply even in the spiritual, where, when we become willing and able to recognize what we are doing, then, all of heaven can back us up with the plan to overcome whatever it might be. And so, the Come to Wisdom's Door and the Mysteries of the Redemption will really get you started on understanding this purification journey. And then you're going to find it throughout the books, but it's just different levels and different manifestations throughout.
Well, that's great that you've been able to write all these books and actually put into words some of what you've experienced, because I know that's obviously not easy as well. And you do say that, I think, in some of your writings, that it's some of this knowledge you can't put into words. It's just a knowing, isn't it? You say that it's
yes.
You can't always put this into words.
Yeah, there are some experiences that are so beyond words that you do whatever you can with words, but you know that it will still be, just a mere shadow of what was really shown to you, because you cannot. We forget that God doesn't think like men thinks, and God's world, the world that God created beyond this one realm, does not all abide by the laws that this one world does. And you see some of the most awe-inspiring things, and it's very fascinating as well as you progress how knowledge actually is infused into you through vibration, and that all of a sudden, you go through some of the procedures, like thinking things through and like, gee, I don't really like that quality about myself, I need to change it. But you don't get it until you are actually lifted up to a higher frequency vibration, and all of a sudden it's like it's been changed within you through the hand of God. And that is what makes it more permanent and more tangible and more of a true alteration within your soul. And that's just a very fascinating thing to see as well, that this is really, knowledge is encapsulated in vibration.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can only try to relate, because I can't honestly say I've had an experience anything like what you're describing.
Okay.
But the research I've done and the people I've met and listened to, I don't need to be convinced that there's so much more out there than the limitations of modern science or physics or any of the conventional knowledge. There's so much that conventional knowledge cannot yet explain, which goes on in the universe. I think even just dreams are fascinating sometimes. I mean, we dream, and sometimes you can wake up from a dream and just feel that it was such a real experience, can't you? It was so real at the time.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, sometimes, depending on the dream, if it was a spiritual dream, sometimes it can be a partial memory of an out-of-body experience, so not fully conscious, because if you're fully conscious, you're going to remember all those other things we talked about. But a lot of people will experience these things in their sleep. And the reality is that we know that everybody experiences out-of-body travel, but most people don't remember it, or they remember tiny bits and pieces of it in dreams. But there are differences between the types of dreams as well, because you'll have just the usual dreams where your brain's trying to work out things of the day, and then once in a while someone will have a mind-blowing spiritual dream that may not be a full-blown, fully conscious out-of-body experience, but they know that it was significant and bore important meaning for them or their life or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I can tell you dreams I've had. I've actually, had conversations with people and just been completely accepting of that particular situation, and then woken up and realized that the person I've just been speaking to in the dream has been dead for 5 years or 10 years or something. And yet there they were, right there and then, having a conversation.
Well, that's oftentimes you remembering an actual conversation with them that took place in the spirit, whether that can be either in the out-of-body travel state or where the person was trying to communicate directly to your mind, and it was done in a way that would be amenable to your mind so that you would remember that you had seen them.
And this is it. We have, obviously, I can only speak for myself, and obviously, everybody's different, but you sometimes take away fragments of dreams and you remember them for quite a long time afterwards.
That's true.
And other times you can just forget it in a second. It's gone, and you can't recall it.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a whole mystery in itself. This fact that we dream, what are the purpose of dreams, and how, why would the consciousness need to dream? That's another big question. Why do we even need to dream? You see, so all this is quite a mystery. I think the whole.
Well, there's some answers I could give you from the out-of-body travel perspective, and also what sleep scientists are starting to touch on, which is, that there is first of all, just from the basic physical science, there is a part of our brains that is really important for our spirits and bodies to be in union with, but from the out-of-body travel in order for us to function on a day-to-day basis. And then in regards to what are the purpose of these dreams and why do we remember some and forget others, because there's a process that's going on unconsciously, because all of us are always receiving unconscious help from spiritual guardians, angels, and sometimes even deceased family members or loved ones who are working with us. And so when you have something and then it is whipped from your mind, it is often an indication that you remembering it at that time would not be helpful consciously, but the unconscious work is being done. And whenever the time comes, whatever they are working on will surface. And so then eventually we remember certain things because it's time for them to surface and become conscious. Things that, realizations that come through to us. But these are also energies, because during the dream processes, people can also be being worked on energetically as well.
Right. So it's multiple aspects to it, is what you're saying. It's not just, obviously not just one thing happening.
Yes.
And can I, on that point, can I ask you, should we try to make more of an attempt to remember our dreams? Is that a good idea, or is that not necessary?
I always recommend that people keep a dream journal, because what I have found, not just with myself, but with all the people that I direct and give spiritual counseling to, is that we have, a narrative starts coming through when you keep a journal that you wouldn't see if you don't have it written down. There's a benefit sometimes to go back and then reread, because then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I didn't put that together. This one was portending this one, and this one was, and you can see how that was brought together, and all of a sudden you have a different realization. And so I always think it's a good idea. What you do learn over time, though, is how to journal the dreams that seem to be more important, that are of more spiritual nature, than rather like the miscombobulated things that are more associated with the brain processing out your day. However, there will be a lot of things that people will experience in their dreams, which is their own mind and their spirit trying to work out situations and conflicts in their conscious waking life. And sometimes there can be a great deal of wisdom in what people receive in that regard as well, as to how to handle certain things in their life. But I definitely always say keep a journal if this is something of interest to you. And then remember, every once in a while, go back and rewrite it and see what you put together that you would never have thought of had you not written it down and then read it together and seen the things that are bringing it all into one.
Well, that's a profound way of looking at it. And I think what tends to happen, of course, is that we get up and we have breakfast, and most of the time it's all forgotten about. It's, as you say, it could be subliminal, couldn't it? But
yes.
To actually recall it, it's just.
Well, one way to combat that is to have paper and a pen near where you sleep, and then one of the things you can do is just take notes when you're having them, because through the night people might have more than one. Take those notes before you go have breakfast. Take some notes so that it will help you to remind yourself what that experience was about, because it then brings the recall back, and then you can bring the details back later. Also, Another thing you can do that helps is when you're really struggling to remember something and it feels important to remember, is try to do that with your eyes remaining closed, because as soon as you open up your eyes, your mind is going from unconscious to conscious.
Okay.
And a lot of times that's when the memories are wiped out, and
Yeah.
it can happen very fast.
I take your point. Because visually, I mean, as soon as you open your eyes, you're visually processing a lot of information, aren't you?
Right.
So, that makes sense, definitely. So for the people who would like to really explore this this whole subject that you've been talking about, which is out of body experiences, are there a few sort of tips and recommendations if people did want to explore this? I mean, obviously they can read some of your material, but is there any other practical suggestions that you have for people who are kind of would like to know more about this, the whole subject?
Well, sure. There are some simple suggestions would be engage in a lot of prayer, meditation, silent time, and spiritual reading every day as much as you can. And when I talk about engaging in meditation, I'm usually talking about 3 hours or more in one sitting. There's a reason for that, because the states of consciousness required to go into the vibrational state take a while, especially with a beginner, to achieve. And so you want to be doing these quiet meditations. I usually recommend mindfulness meditations where you just focus on the breath and you don't worry about anything else. And you're trying to literally allow your consciousness to alter. But obviously, too, there's a lot of other things that are a little more complex, which is, go to the website, download Come to Wisdom's Door, The Mysteries of the Redemption as well. And we have a course of study at the website, and it is free to take as well. And it's very in-depth, so it takes you through quite a few things, and it will teach you quite a bit. And it also has a handout with extra works of mystical theology that you can read, as well as a suggested order of reading for my own books so that people can follow it in sequence. But, if you go to the website and you start with those 2 books and you need more guidance from there, just pop me an email. My email is readily available, and I'll tell you what to do next. If you're not a beginner, and if you're somewhere and you're like, well, where do I start? Just go to the website at outofbodytravel.org and send me an email and tell me a little bit about where you're at, and I will tell you where I think you would best start, considering what you've already done. And so we can get you up and running, pretty quickly, but it is it's a process that requires a lot of discipline and patience. And so I would recommend those as well,
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, I must say, I'll just say that it's a very generous thing that you've done is to put all this information and make all those books free. Anybody listening can just click on the link and find some of those books and download them and find out a whole lot more about this subject. So I think we've just about covered it, haven't we? I'd like to say thank you very much, Marilynn, for coming on the show today. And
thank you, Anthony.
No, that's great. And thank you to all the listeners. I hope you found something in there which is of use to you or of interest in some way. And we'll talk to you again. Thank you.